Join that group there. It's the quietest discussion groups I've ever heard. Yeah, I didn't number them for whatever reason. Yeah, genetically engineered feed is actually quite expensive, and that's one of the reasons he doesn't use it. He uses hybrid corn, but virtually everybody does. But he doesn't use genetically engineered corn.
Corn productivity. I think I saw it average back in 1920 was about 20 bushels per acre.
So as you're going through and discussing, you can just go through and answer the questions, but then you can also add to those questions as you go. It'll give you a richer experience. So, for example, he doesn't plant GMO corn. So, what's his rationale for that? Is he just anti-technology? Is he an organic farmer, or like what's his underlying rationale for making that particular decision? You guys are amazingly quiet. Makes me think you're up to no good.
Where's the section on 113 that talks about the 13 forms of corn?
What's that?
We were talking about the first one and the deconstructing of the chicken.
On page 4 of that, he cites the judge's decision that McNuggets only McFrankensteinian creation of various elements. Not utilized by them.
I guess what that says about these sciences is you want to make stuff as cheap as possible.
Well, so what's one of his main points here? It's at the bottom of page 112.
The ingredients listed as the flyer, so there's a lot of thought goes into the nugget that has a lot of corn.
Yeah, virtually all of these things that are in the nugget are corn in one form or another. The chicken itself is fed with corn, and then all these other things, emulsifiers, the breading, all of that stuff is once again corn. It's been boiled in corn oil, et cetera, et cetera. So going back to this idea that we are people of the corn, if you eat a chicken nugget, you're basically eating like 100% unadulterated corn. Now, some of that corn is delivered to you in protein form, in the form of the chicken, but a lot of it is just derived from corn. You guys know much about food scientists? They actually do research in terms of like scents and things like this that like turn people on. So when you drive down 152 and you go past the Freddy's and the Burger King and stuff like that, all of those scents that you smell coming out of those places are designed by food scientists. whose goal is to create scents that make you want to go in there and buy a burger or whatever. They definitely do. I think did I mention to you guys earlier? Go into a grocery store and just make a note of everything that's red. All the packaging in the grocery store that is red. There's a huge amount of it because our visual system is keyed to the color red. It's one of the colors that stands out at us really easily. So advertisers use that. They know these things. Walmart, their interior color is blue. Blue is a cool, soothing color. You're more likely to stay in an environment that is painted blue than one that is painted some other color. All of these things are designed to manipulate you, the shopper. Think about the layout of a grocery store. Produce is always up front. It's the first thing that you see, giving you the impression, oh, I'm about to enter a place that is full of fresh, healthy food. Then you round the corner. For a long time, right around the corner from the produce and the Hy-Vee here in town, right around the corner was a whole, like almost half store wide rack of candy. And where's the milk and eggs in every grocery store you've ever been in? In the back. You have to walk through all the rest of the store in order to get to the things that everybody goes and buys, which is milk and eggs at some point. They don't do that by accident. They could. Some people are like, well, that's where they run the utilities. The utilities are in the back wall. But the fact of the matter is, there are utility sockets all over the store. They choose to put them in the back of the store because everybody's going to go there, and you have to walk through the whole store to get there. More store you walk through, the more likely you are to think, oh yeah, we need more cereal. Pick up cereal and throw it in your basket on your way to the milk aisle.
Clever strategy.
The Price Chopper over here off 291. You walk in, there are the checkout aisles to the right, but then to the left is the deli counter, such that you have to walk all the way around that, and you're forced by kind of the way the front of the store is laid out. They park you, they end you up. To get into the store, you have to walk to the back left corner of the store, and then you have to work your way back out. So the store design it's not random. It's designed for a reason. Continue. I feel like I've hijacked your discussion.
Test time always just recommends, the idea that maybe the sort of formats change in some fashion. Those are isotopes that if you take sample of nail or strand of hair, they'll come back to the C4, whereas the person who doesn't need a lot of core back to C3, so that way you can tell how much point breathing.
Yeah, we carry around more heavy isotopes of carbon because we eat a lot of C4 plants.
That's why I'm getting the question right. Yeah, we need to peel it.
They've lost their natural mechanisms for getting the kernels off the cob, so that if you were to just take an ear of corn and plant it in the field, none of that would sprout because it's wrapped up in leaves, it's attached to the cob, et cetera, et cetera. So it's really dead in the water evolutionarily without us. We'll discuss the specifics of the New Deal and why they were encouraged not to plant in class. There were economic reasons for that, but they're complicated. Ah, the New Deal. You guys are reading up on the New Deal. Awesome. I mean, if you can find what they are written about somewhere, more power to you, but take some research to figure it all out.
So we'll talk about the section before we go to what they were doing before 1947. They were a munitions plant. So, and they switched over to making chemical fertilizer.
Mm-hmm.
Switched over.
Yeah, so I think it said they had like a surplus of that ammonium nitrate, so they used that for fertilizer.
They were making bombs. So think about not Earl Betts. Think about Fritz Haber, 1897, invents industrial fixation. What happens at the very beginning of the 20th century? World War One. So one of the questions you can ask yourself as a critical thinking student is, to what degree would World War One have grown into the scale of a war that it was had you not had a readily available supply of ammonium nitrate, one of the main components in making gunpowder? So Fritz Haber invented industrial fixation with agriculture in mind, but it was also easily repurposed for use in munitions. That happened in 1897. By 1914, we were embroiled in warfare in Europe that, quite frankly, expanded quite a lot. To what degree would that have war gotten that out of hand if we hadn't been able to industrially produce ammonium nitrate? Prior to Fritz Haber, you had to mine it. You would find deposits in sedimentary rocks of ammonium nitrate. You would mine it. It was relatively uncommon in sedimentary deposits, and so it was kind of a limiting factor in making munitions. What else did Fritz Haber do that was used in World War One? Did I ask you that in the questions?
About how you like on the front lines directing first gas attacks.
He also did research on pesticides. So he was an agriculturally oriented scientist prior to World War One, but anything that you can use to kill insects, you can probably use to kill humans also. So we're about to enter a section where we talk about world history from basically the year 1900 to the present. And you've probably received that history at some time or another in your past education. I hope you have. We had to take a couple of history classes when I was in high school, but my guess is you've probably never thought about the history of the United States viewed through the lens of food and agriculture, and that's what we're going to do. And this is kind of the beginning of it.
New Deal. Earl. He was the second, he was Richard Nixon's second Secretary of Agriculture.
What can you guys remember from the New Deal just from your past training in history?
Agriculture-wise, or
Just in general.
It was created by FDR to help them get out of the Great Depression.
Okay, so it was a Depression era thing. Was it concentrated on jobs? Was it concentrated on agriculture? Was it concentrated on all these things?
Really, they had a lot of things.
It had a ton of things in it. It was like the most sweeping legislative agenda in the entire 20th century, and probably the most sweeping agenda in all of American history since the year 1900. So what were the details of it? What was it trying to do? That'll take you a little while to explore. Did you guys fully explore the New Deal already? Certainly not, because you don't seem like you're talking about it anymore.
I was looking through where there's the sun.
Oh yeah, I just ran across that a minute ago. Are you looking for the reference?
Yeah. I don't see a word.
Oh, sorry, not bull shoals. Did I say bull shoals?
Yeah.
Oh, it's muscle shoals.
Okay.
Sorry, it's on page 41.
Yeah.
Misprint. I guess I need to fix that.
Okay, I thought bull shows is like
Muscle shoals is where it's located.
why is this significant to it? It gives us sort of
Where are you at? Oh yeah, okay.
he gives us on page 42 something of a chronological answer. So he talks about Naylor's Father's Day, and they would carefully rotate crops, and they were growing corn more than twice in the same field every year. But after that, the yields of corn exploded by the use of chemical fertilizer. And of course, they were limited in their supply of nitrogen, but Fritz-Haber comes around, shows them a new trick that can increase the supply of nitrogen, or at least make available more nitrogen. And in 1972, we can see Chinese government replaced So 13 massive fertilizer factories, and without those, China would probably have started as we have seen. The Haber-Bosch process has dramatically expanded how much corn a farmer can grow, and perhaps give rise to modern agriculture to feed billions.
So synthetic agriculture was important. What other things do you think of when you think of modern agriculture? So obviously synthetic fertilizer was important, but that wasn't the only thing. It was just a hugely important thing. Sorry, what was that? I didn't hear. I just pulled over. Oh yeah. Should have yourself some nice homemade lizard masks. Yeah, he did work on pesticides also, and anything that can kill insects can probably also be used to kill humans.
Yeah.
Yeah. Why would you encourage farmers to not plant arable land?
Because the lower amount of the crop to sell, the higher the price.
Okay, so this was a price boosting mechanism. So why were farmers having trouble getting a good price for their goods during the Depression? Well, actually, during the years between the end of World War I and when the Depression began, why were American farmers hurting because their crops were selling for so cheap?
Did not for the depression.
Nope. Now, this was a problem before the Depression even. What causes price if lower supply causes prices to rise, what causes prices to drop?
Surplus.
Surplus. Why would American farmers have been experiencing a surplus? Maybe that they're producing more, but what else might have been happening? Okay, so prior to the Great Depression, American farmers grew crops for themselves, but what else did they grow them for? Who else were American farmers providing crops to? We still do this today. We grow a certain amount of food for us, and then what do we do with a lot of our surplus? Nope. We try not to toss it because that's just lost revenue. Hmm? Yeah, we have an export market that we provide food to. So who was America's major export market in the early part of the 20th century, do you suspect? No. Soviet Union was a minor player on the world stage at that particular point in history. We weren't thinking about Russia at all at that point in history, really. During World War One, what was our main contribution to the war effort in World War One? Because we didn't enter World War One until it was practically over. Yeah, we were sending ships supplying food and weapons and things like that to European countries. A lot of these Western European countries were our allies during World War One. So during the era leading up to World War One, we had a very active export market with Europe. That export market suffered during World War One because, of course, what was the German government doing during World War One?
They were like sinking our ships.
They were sinking ships that were providing supplies to the Allies. We weren't actively involved in World War One, but we were actively involved in supporting the war effort of our allies. But that was mainly by supplying goods to them. One of those goods was food. During that time, of course, what did Europe have to do if they weren't getting food imports from the United States? Yeah, they had to provide for themselves. So during World War One and the period after World War One, European agriculture became much more self-sufficient as a result of, once again, this conflict. And so during that time period, American farmers were producing a lot of food. They were selling it domestically, but the export market had fallen off, so they were stuck with a surplus. You have a big surplus of food, the price of that food goes down because of the law of supply and demand. So farmers were already struggling before the Great Depression hit. So the first thing that Roosevelt did with the Agricultural Adjustment Act of 1933 is he basically got Congress to approve a plan to scale back production of American farms. You have fewer crops to sell, but you're selling all those crops at a higher price because you've basically cut into supply. So then the question is, well, that went terribly wrong. Why did that go terribly wrong? It was a disastrously bad move on Roosevelt's part.
On cutting the production.
Cutting production.
When this article talks about, like, farmers had already planted and they'd be like, get rid of it.
That's not the biggest problem. What started happening? What else happened during the Great Depression? The Great Depression wasn't just a economic catastrophe. It was also an environmental catastrophe. What else happened that just happened to coincide during that same time period of history? The Dust Bowl. So right before you get this prolonged drought in the Midwest, you cut production. You cut production to raise prices, then you get a Dust Bowl, a drought, crops crash in the mid-1930s. And so now all of a sudden the problem isn't farmers can't get a good enough price for their crops. What is the problem now? You can't grow enough food. Food prices skyrocket. There are food shortages, et cetera, et cetera. So this thing that seemed like a good idea in 1933, by 1935 is a terrible idea. Because now there are food shortages in the United States. Food prices are extremely high at a time when we're also going through a depression where people have less money to spend on food. Once again, viewing the depression through the eyes of agriculture gives you a slightly different take on, how truly hard it was on a lot of people, because less money, higher food prices, it just makes it more difficult for everybody to get by during that time. So later on, there were later agricultural adjustment acts. What did those agricultural adjustment acts do? They weren't so much focused on controlling production. What did the later agricultural adjustment acts do with regard to agriculture?
Soil conservation.
Very last question, what was farmers doing to make
Have you guys successfully plumbed the depths of the New Deal for agricultural information?
I felt like we knew a bit about it. First, I remember one of the things, this was a different class, the government was subsidizing people's lots of row crops, and actually got, challenged in court about whether or not.
It did.
Yes, in 1942. And then,
It was challenged even before that. It was
Really?
challenged in the 1930s, which is why there was an Agricultural Adjustment Act of 1933. There was another one in 1936 and another in 38.
and
So-
of course, the Supreme Court case which says they can do that.
So the beginning of that was concentrated on reducing production. So then the question is, why would you encourage farmers to produce fewer crops rather than more crops? I mean, to raise prices, because there was an overproduction. Why was the overproduction? You might have overheard me talking about this with those guys. Well, because the export market to Europe had fallen during the first part of the 20th century. So farmers that had been growing a lot of crops, selling it to Americans, and then also exporting the surplus to Europe were no longer doing that to the degree that they were before the 20th century, or the first decade of the 20th century at least. So you cut production by being subsidized by the government to put land into conservation easements. Um, that's a good soil conservation strategy, although soil conservation wasn't on anybody's mind at the time. It was simply agricultural application of the law of supply and demand. Reduce supply, price goes up, better for farmers. This was in 1933. What happened in the mid-30s in the American Midwest? Dust Bowl. Terrible time to be cutting production right before that happens. But of course, nobody knew that that was going to happen. That was a climate-driven event. Yeah, grapes of wrath stuff. So you have a period of 2 or 3 years of lowered production to raise prices, then followed by this extreme multi-year drought that causes crashes in agricultural productivity throughout the Midwest and the eastern part of the United States. And now all of a sudden, the issue isn't too much food. The issue is not enough food. Food prices are extremely high. People are going hungry at a time when they also don't have a lot of money to pay for more expensive food because you're now smack dab in the middle of the Depression. So this climatic factor that happened to correspond with this economic event, the two of those things were just really catastrophic for Americans and for everybody actually in the world. A lot of times when we teach about the Great Depression, we teach about it with a very U.S. centric sort of lens. But the fact of the matter, it was a global depression, just like the 2008 recession was a global recession as well. So we were having problems here. They were having problems in Europe. Everybody was suffering in all the industrialized countries at that particular moment in time. We don't pay attention to European history because we're Americans and we just really don't care about that. But they were having same issues in Germany. Germany was also struggling with the aftermath of World War I. You guys know what happened to Germany after World War I in terms of their relationship with the countries of Western Europe?
All the debt and that screwed up the economy.
They had to pay war reparations as part of the treaty that ended World War I. Germany had to pay war reparations, and they paid them dutifully for the entirety of German history. I think it was up until 2001 when they finally paid off World War I war reparations. I have to look up that date. I meant to do that this morning before I came to class, but I forgot. For a really long time, the only time that they didn't pay was during World War II, during Hitler's regime, when Hitler was like, "We're not doing that." Are you looking up when they finally paid off? Oh, 2010.
Yeah.
2010. Okay, it was even longer. So Germany's been paying off World War I war reparations from the end of World War I to 2010. During that time period, right after World War I, that just wreaked havoc with Germany's economy, and you can look on the web and you can find pictures of people like wheeling wheelbarrows full of money to the bread shop to buy a loaf of bread because inflation had gotten so bad because of the combination of the Depression and the just lack of availability of food, driving up the price of any food commodity that you might think of. So there was the Agricultural Adjustment Act of 1933. There were other agricultural adjustment acts that came after that. How did those acts differ from one another? You guys haven't even come close to plumbing the depths of the Great Depression and the New Deal from the standpoint of agriculture. How are you guys doing? Join a group. Come on over. What are you doing over there by yourself? Come be with this group. They have fewer people.
getting ready.
Just getting ready, working himself up. All right. What are you guys learning?
About chicken nugget.
Oh, did you guys finish with the other agricultural adjustment acts?
Yeah, we talked a little bit about Earl Butz, but
Well, to know what Earl Butz did, you have to kind of understand what the later agricultural adjustment acts did. After the Dust Bowl decimated U.S. agriculture, later agricultural adjustment acts put into being a set of policies that helped buffer American agriculture from running out of food during times that were bad, but also helped stabilize food prices when years were agriculturally good in terms of productivity. What was that mechanism?
I know that farmers were told to plant like alfalfa grass to just put nutrients back in the soil.
Sure, that's actually a type of grass that actually also fixes nitrogen, so that's good for soil. One of the problems with the Dust Bowl was they had over-farmed land, so then when a drought came along, the soil wasn't very well formed and they lost a lot of it. That was the reason for these big dust storms. It was just topsoil blowing away. But of course, people don't eat alfalfa. So what did we do in terms of especially seed crops, corn and wheat and beans and things like this? What was done at the end of the New Deal that wasn't done at the beginning of the New Deal was a shift from controlling production to controlling supply. And how did the federal government go about doing this? Look up the term ever normal granary. Poland talks about this.
What is it?
Ever normal granary?
Is it like it was made in China?
Hmm?
It was like originated from China, and then Henry Laws
Actually, I think Wallace got it from the Bible. I think the Bible was Wallace's inspiration for it. What's the story in the Bible that has to do with storing grain?
I found that, that, nobody stored until that when there's a surplus of,
Yep. hmm
surplus of goods, and then when there's a shortage, they're sold.
Yep. So that's the way it works. So in years that are good for farmers, farmers have a lot of commodity that they're trying to sell. But because everybody's having a good year, it's not just you having a good year, your neighbor's having a good year, George over the hill's having a good year. During those years, you have a lot of supply. Supply suppresses price. And so even though you have a lot of commodity to sell, you're selling that at a lower price, and so you don't make as much money. So what the government would do during those good productive years is they would buy up surplus. Buying up surplus would take the commodity off the market. That would decrease supply, which would boost price so that farmers could stay afloat. The government then stored that, and then during periods of low productivity, they could release those stored commodities onto the market, and it would both supply food to Americans, but it would also reduce the price of those commodities for Americans. So it was really a way of moderating both supply, but also moderating price fluctuations in the market. Where did he get the idea?
It says in the story of Joseph.
Yeah, go back to your Bible stories for those of you who were steeped in Judeo-Christian religion. Joseph had this dream. What was the content of the dream?
It says during 7 years of good weather and surplus of crops for the use of 6 years after.
Yeah, so he had this dream about goats feeding at a trough, and there were 7 goats that, I think if I recall correctly, 7 goats that were well fed, and then after that there were 7 goats that starved to death, and Joseph was known as an interpreter of dreams, and he interpreted this as the nation would experience 7 good years, and then they would experience 7 bad years, and everybody would die not everybody, but a lot of people would die during the famine that was in the second 7 years. And so he went to the Pharaoh and said, you need to plan for this. And so during these 7 good years, they built a bunch of granaries and they stored up food, and then that got them through the 7 bad years that inevitably followed. So it was an idea that Wallace got from the biblical story of Joseph and his dream interpretations. But the idea was sound economically because it allowed you to buffer against times of shortage while also controlling prices during times of abundance. Um, and that was the economic system for farming, for supporting farming, that stayed in place until the Nixon administration in the early 1970s. So as you go down I-35 into downtown, on the left-hand side of the road as you're going south, there is a jewelry store. It's a big rectangular, squarish, cubicle building. I think it's a Murado jewelry store. It's just sitting there in the river bottoms on all this blank land behind it. It looks so weird to me when I see it. But a couple of years ago, that was filled with grain silos. Really tall grain silos, all lined up in a row along the railroad tracks. Those were silos that were built as a result of this grain storage system that was put in place during the Great Depression, that was designed to store up great amounts of grain during these periods of agricultural productivity that then would be released onto the market when prices rose because productivity plummeted. And those silos were torn down, one, because they were old, and two, they weren't even being used anymore because that's not how we do agriculture any longer. So now that you kind of have that historical context, what did Earl Butz do that kind of changed all of that and kind of led to how we do agriculture today in terms of funding it and helping support farmers. None of you are history majors, are you? No. Okay.
Political science.
Political science adjacent. I think history professors might object to that.
One of the New Deal, the fact that the New Deal, before FDR into the White House, only 9 out of 10 rural Americans had no electricity, and then shortly after his death, about 90% had electricity.
So another part of the New Deal was a rural electric cooperative movement, certainly, getting electricity out to the masses.
I guess from like a broader perspective, New Deal brought about kind of transportation.
Yeah, so the New Deal was largely a public works program, but the whole purpose of public works was to put people back to work. So a lot of the things, if you go to national parks and you see these beautiful lodge buildings that are the headquarters of the parks and stuff, a lot of that was built during the New Deal, during the Great Depression by the Civilian Conservation Corps. Major infrastructure projects like dams and things like that were built as part of the New Deal. The goal was just to get people back to work, and the way the government did that to a large degree was by spending a ton of government money in building up American infrastructure. During the 2008 recession, one of my biggest disappointments with Barack Obama was the fact that instead of investing in a works program kind of like the New Deal, we spent billions and billions and billions of dollars bailing out banks, who were the very institutions that got us into that recession in the first place. So it was almost like, oh, you messed up the economy. Here, let's reward you by giving you all this money to get you out of hock. And then he didn't do that, and now here we are in the year 2021 talking about infrastructure because we've neglected our infrastructure for so long. I bicycle a lot, and I'll go over bridges. And a number of years ago, I started noticing that on bridges here in Missouri, they'll have signs at the beginning of the bridge, and it says, safe and sound. And I'm like, oh, that's good. This is a safe and sound bridge. Until you go across the next bridge, and it doesn't have that sign, and you're like, how safe and sound is it? And the weird thing is that there's one bridge on O Highway, out towards Oric, going between Excelsior Springs and Oric, and it had a safe and sound sign on it. And when I rolled over it, like there are these big 3 or 4 foot holes in the bridge up next to the rail of the bridge. I'm like, if that's safe and sound, what does not safe and sound constitute? So we could have done something with infrastructure back in 2008, and the Obama administration and Congress at the time chose to do something different in order to get America out of that mess. And I was sorely disappointed.
And also no one went to jail.
Yeah, well, so many things disappointed me about Obama during that time period. But this class is not about my disappointments with Barack Obama. I like a lot of other things that he did, but I thought him and Congress really dropped the ball on that opportunity. Because you could have put people back to work building bridges and repairing roads and making a shift to an electrical grid that is better at power transmission so that you could have electricity generated renewably in places and get it to where it gets used, et cetera, et cetera. But we didn't do any of that stuff. Evernormal Granary. Did you guys read about the Evernormal Granary? So you guys were talking about the first Agricultural Adjustment Act, which was designed at decreasing production to raise prices, but there were later agricultural adjustment acts. And the later ones of these, the one in 1938 in particular, called for the formation of the ever-normal granary. What was it and what was it designed to do?
Finding a sort of surplus zone to stabilize prices and safeguard.
Oh, you just read the Merriam-Webster dictionary version of it. Who came up with it? What was the basis for it? How did it work? How did it function in the United States? The ever-normal granary? They didn't just looked it up and got the Merriam-Webster dictionary version. You guys talking about ecology of food, or are you guys talking about something else? Or are you guys?
Talking about our groups.
Oh, talking about your groups. That is not on the task for today. Are you done with everything?
No, but no, I just wanted to quick introduction.
What are you guys on? What's the last question?
Talking about both and how he
Oh, Earl Butts, yeah.
abolished the everyone granary.
Why?
Because he began replacing the ecosystem and with like fruit loans and government grain purchases and land items.
But why? That's what he did. Why did he do it?
The boost behind.
One way he wanted to make farmers bigger and more productive.
Once again, why? You're not getting at the why. So the ever normal granary had been in place since the end of the New Deal to the early 1970s. What was the precipitating set of factors that led to Earl Butts wanting to do something different? Regardless of what the nature of that different thing was, why was the ever normal granary not working? Nope. After World War II, what happened at Muscle Shoals, Alabama? Had this munitions plant, got converted over to producing fertilizer. What other things happened in agriculture after World War II? World War II set America up to be the dominant power for the remainder of the 20th century. And it was due to a lot of things. One of the things was it increased our manufacturing capacity amazingly, especially our manufacturing capacity for heavy machinery. During World War II, we had to ramp up a couple of things in terms of production, right? What kinds of things did we have to ramp up production of? Yeah, during World War II. We were in World War II for a much longer period of the war than we were in World War I. What kind of supplies? What do you need to? Okay, so we developed a lot more infrastructure for producing munitions. So that's why you had munitions plants around the country. Those munitions plants got repurposed after the war to produce fertilizer. What else do you need to fight a war? You need jeeps and tanks and ships and planes. All of that manufacturing capacity, what happened to that manufacturing capacity after World War II? Especially for producing large machinery like tanks.
Instead of tank.
What's that?
Instead of tank.
You started building tractors and combines and stuff like that. Tractors were relatively uncommon prior to World War II, but after World War II was over, you didn't need nearly as many tanks and trucks and things like that. And so companies that were producing those things retooled themselves to produce things like tractors and combines and stuff like that. And so the end of World War II ushered in a period of increasing industrialization on farms where rather than relying on oxen and horses and mules and things like that, they were more reliant upon tractors. Now a single farmer could farm a much larger plot of land than he could before because he was doing it from the seat of a tractor. What happened to agricultural productivity in the United States after World War II? It went up drastically. Year after year after year after year. Those same companies that produce tanks and things like that also were capable of producing irrigation systems. Like just heavy manufacturing capacity in the United States was huge. Um, so we went around from 1940 to 1970 or 1945 to 1970 with just ever increasing agricultural productivity with very few bad years in all of that time. What's happening to the ever normal granary during that time? Hmm? Nope, it's still there. It's still functioning the way it was functioning in the New Deal. Why is that a problem for the federal government and Earl Butz? Year after year after year, what are they having to do? They're buying up grain and putting it in silos. Run out of room in silos, what do they have to do? They have to build more silos, continue buying up grain from American farmers. So finally, the federal government is sitting on all this grain, and it's becoming increasingly expensive to continue that program. So what happens in the early 1970s? They have a drought in Russia, and now Russia is hurting for grain. Nixon was a very global thinker, and so he was a person who reached out to China. He was a person who reached out to Russia because he was of the opinion that it's better to have these people on our sides than to have these people as enemies, which is not a bad idea. Nixon had other bad ideas, but that was not a bad idea. And so Russia was suffering a famine, and we had all this grain that we've been sitting on that is expensive to store, and we can make a grain sale to Russia. We can recoup the costs of all of this grain storage. At the same time, we make Russia indebted to us in a way, in a very, if not monetarily way, but in a goodwillish sort of way. So they make this grain sale, and they basically sell off the entire ever normal granary to Russia. And at that point, there's no grain in the ever normal granary system, and that's an opportunity for Earl Butz to say, this is a program that has been really, really expensive in the past. Let's just get it and come up with something that is potentially more cost effective. And he replaced it with the current subsidy system. So the subsidy system that Earl Butz put into place in 1973 is largely the subsidy system that we have here today, which is this process of subsidizing farmers on a per bushel price basis, this idea of setting a floor price for commodities. And if the market falls because productivity is high, then the government makes up that difference between the floor price and the market price. But in bad years, when supplies go down and prices go up, they don't do anything because farmers are getting more per bushel for their crop than the floor price is. And so the government doesn't do anything in those years. The government is now not storing a bunch of grain. They're not incurring those costs. They're just incurring the cost of whatever the subsidy costs them every year. The outcome of that is that the economics of how you farm change. So Earl Butz didn't want farms to get big, but when small farmers found it non-economical to function, his response to them was get bigger, get out. Because the way you make money in the current market is you plant as much corn or as much soybean as you can. If you overproduce, all that happens is the market price falls below the floor price, and then you get a subsidy check from the government to make up the difference. So you know that you're always going to get at least the floor price for your crop. So the way you make more money in agriculture is you plant more acreage, produce more bushels, because it doesn't matter how many bushels you produce beyond what the market can actually bear, the federal government will make up the difference between the market, the floor price and the market price when farmers are overproducing. So if you want to get rich in farming, you need to have giant farms producing as many bushels as you can. And that's why he said, get bigger, get out. That wasn't his goal. That was his response to small scale farmers who were complaining about the changing economics of farming. And that is largely how we fund agriculture today. No surprise that it was in the early 1970s that we started having this surplus of corn that then led us to repurpose that corn for all sorts of repurposings. What's a major repurposing that occurred once again back in the 2000s? Nope, that happened back in the 1970s. That was the first big repurposing of corn. 2000s, Congress passed a law about gasoline. It was designed to wean us off of non-renewable sources of fossil fuels and move us towards fuels that were renewable. When you go to the pump now, almost all the gasoline that you buy is a mixture of what and what. Gasoline and says it on every pump. Read your pump next time you go to get gas. Are you guys just lurking and listening? Oh my gosh. What's this?
It's more informative to listen to you than read.
Okay. So now we've repurposed corn to make ethanol. And so with a surplus of corn that is a result of farmers producing tons of corn because they get subsidized from the government to produce tons of corn, we've repurposed corn into all sorts of things. The first thing that we repurposed, and no surprise that soda drink manufacturers shifted from cane sugar to high fructose corn syrup in the mid-70s. It was a response to this superabundance of cheap corn that was a result of this change in the way agriculture is funded in the United States. That has continued throughout all this history, and in the early 2000s, Congress passed a law that was designed to wean us off of fossil fuels a little bit, and it requires all fuel makers to mix in 10% ethanol into the gas mixture. So when you look at the pumps, when you go to the gas station, you'll see that there's a little sign on the pumps that says this gas may contain up to 10% ethanol content. And you have to have a different design of your engine if you're going to mix in more ethanol into your fuel mix than that. But once again, that was to repurpose corn so that they could find a market for this surplus of corn that was being produced, because if farmers can then sell part of their corn crop to an ethanol plant, that takes that corn off of the market. That raises the price of corn. If it raises it above the floor price, then the government doesn't have to provide a subsidy for that. So once again, this was a way of diversifying the uses of corn to reduce supply, to raise price, so that the government has a smaller bill every year in terms of total subsidies. We're going to go through this in a more formal way next week sometime, so that we're kind of all on the same page, because I haven't been monitoring both groups. But this is how you view history in a different way than you viewed it in your history class. I want you to think about 20th century history through the lens of agriculture, because what you're going to find is that there's all this stuff that happened in history class that was tied to agriculture that they never taught you about in history class because they weren't trained to think about agriculture. So we'll continue talking about chapter 8 and chapter 11 on Monday, but same deal. If you haven't read chapter 8 and chapter 11, you're not going to have a very good time on Monday because you won't have much to say. So be sure and read those over the weekend.